We're recording.
All right. Hey, Norman. Okay, so last week we kind of were talking about the Clementine literature, and that's broken up into a few different things. You have the homilies, the recognitions, which those in a lot of places run concurrently, but in some places they diverge. And then, of course, you have the different manuscripts of the Latin, the Syriac, the Greek, which I don't think we have anymore. You've got the letters at the beginning, the letter of from Peter to James, and then you have the letter from Clement to James. And then is there anything else that's included with the literature? I think that's it. But the question was last week, is the literature saying something that is specifically anti-Pauline? Can we nail that down, or can we cross that off? Can we exonerate that and say that maybe it's pro-Torah, pro-Jewish Christianity, but maybe not necessarily anti-Pauline? So it's an interesting subject for me when I first started studying things in regards to all of this, whatever this journey is that we're all on. One of the first places that I happened upon was a very anti-Pauline website. And, it was anathema to me to even think anything, any such thing. I could certainly think that, hey, people are using his words incorrectly and they've created doctrines, et cetera, that are not good. But that thought hadn't really crossed my mind. And I kind of said, I'm not going back to that website, for a while, because I need to, study some other stuff and figure some other things out first. But so right away in my journey that, popped up to me. So I don't know if anybody else did well, I do know some people did some research, but I don't know how many did. But does anybody have anything they want to share that they found or didn't find? Or would you guys rather me just start going through what I saw and then,
we'll tear it apart.
Yeah. Exactly. Hatch it away. Okay. Well, the first thing I would say, and I'm going to share my screen here. I will share the whole screen, I think. The desktop, and then we'll just. Okay. Are you guys all seeing this right here? You seeing? This is the.
Yeah.
So this is, I don't want to do that. Let me get out of here for a second. I'll just make it bigger because it's.
Well, this book looks familiar.
Yeah, somebody I know translated this. So right here in the first part we have, I'm just going to show all the things, all possibilities of what could be anti-Pauline, and then we can decide or figure out or try to decide or disagree, is it actually anti-Pauline, or is it just is it anti-Pauline only, meaning some groups may have been using Paul's words to say a certain something, or is it in fact anti-Paul the man? So here in the second part of the second chapter of the letter from Peter to James, he says, in order, therefore, that the like may also be to those among us as to the 70, given the scrolls of my preaching to our brethren, give the scrolls of my preaching to our brethren, which with the like mystery of initiation, that they may indoctrinate those who wish to take part in teaching, for if it be not so done, our word of truth will be rent into many opinions, which we can see played out today. And this I know, not as being a prophet, but as already seeing the beginning of this very evil. For some from among the Goyim have rejected my Torah-observant preaching, attaching themselves to certain Torahless and trifling preaching of the man who is my enemy. And these things some have attempted while I am still alive to transform my words by certain various interpretations in order to bring about the dissolution of the Torah, as though I also myself were of such a mind, but did not freely proclaim it, which Yahweh forbid. So here we see right away that he is speaking about the fact that some goyim, some Gentiles who are seemingly pro Yeshua, in at least in name, have rejected his, Kepha's, Peter's, Torah observant preaching, and then they've attached themselves to certain Torahless and trifling preachings of the man who is my enemy. Okay, so right there, that takes my mind to look at the letters that are attributed to Paul and say, are there any words about not following Torah in the letters of Paul? And I think, in fact, there are, unless anybody has, a discussion about that. I don't think that everything that everyone uses to say Paul is doing away with the Torah is necessarily Paul doing away with the Torah. But certainly, if you get into Galatians and parts of Romans and parts of Corinthians, even you've got some things that are hard to explain if you're a Torah observant follower of Paul. Does anybody have any comments or questions on that?
Sure do. I do.
Go for it.
There's a word in here that's important, because this is really a most amazing quote. And that word is my enemy. If
Sure.
you go back to book 1, chapter, I'm thinking 69 or 70, this is exactly how the man who had letters from the high priest is described as my enemy, not by a name, but with that alias. Also, there's a couple things that we need to consider in regards to this passage, and that is, one is it's at 2 Peter, 1 Peter, where all of a sudden there's like an interpolation. They're talking about Paul's letters being hard, and some people...
2 Peter 3, yeah.
2 Peter, okay. 2 Peter 3. With that in mind, and the third thing regarding Paul and the Torah is that Paul would have had a very difficult time with the Torah in Europe, where he was going. He's going to Macedonia and Greece and Spain and these various places that were not provinces as much, but rather Roman Empire proper. And there was a law at that time called the Lex Cornelius. And in that law, it made it a capital offense to mutilate genitals. The main reason for that, well, two reasons. One was because of the castration of boys, and second of all, because of the propensity at that time for people to convert to Judaism. There were a lot, even at the highest places in the empire, that converted, and mostly secretly. But Paul can hardly go up there with full freedom and hobnob with all these imperial types that are mentioned in Philippians and Romans 16, people there that we know, people close to the emperor, and 2 Timothy 4 that are really close to the emperor, and be cutting up genitals for circumcision. So we find that as one of the big reasons that Paul dissents from the crowd. Excuse me. I know that it's mentioned in Acts, or not mentioned, and probably not mentioned in Galatians, but certainly he's not going to go up there with the interest of doing circumcisions, which are required according to Torah. That's one thing. The second thing is that Romans were known for especially the upper crust, the variety of foods that they ate, because they would bring in all kinds of stuff from all over the empire. Most of it was unclean food. And you see, Peter who sat with the Gentiles. When those from James came up, Peter, even Barnabas gets up from the table from eating with Gentiles. Obviously, that's a true story. And it's obvious when you read the recognitions here in regards to his opinions about unclean food, which are, usually the Nazarene Acts and the Acts of the Apostles in the canon both use the same primary sources. And so we've got one of them speaking about, well, all foods are clean, supposedly, even though that's not what Peter's vision is about. That's what everybody interprets it, and it may be written to interpret that way. And you've got in the Nazarene Acts the same kind of passage, only he talks about in book 4 that when you're eating unclean foods or certain types of meats, you're eating demons, and that the demons are going inside of you with that food. So Paul, that's the other thing, table fellowship. Can Paul go up there and have that kind of an attitude toward food, or what is food, what isn't food, and get by? There's even a third thing. We could talk about women here and what Paul did to disguise women in Europe. But this is enough here to say that certainly we're talking about Paul here, though he's never mentioned. However, I don't think that the stuff about Simon Magus has anything to do with Paul, though a lot of exegetes think so. They're unfinished.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that last point. I don't think that the Simon Magus stuff has to do with it. But here, I think the point that I would take from what you just said that's especially convincing to me is the terminology, the man who is my enemy, and then that the word is used, when he gets orders from the high priest, and then that's attached back to the actual canon proper, because that's a parallel story, and that from the canon is obviously about Paul. It
comes right down to, do you believe Luke in Acts chapter 9? Do you believe Acts chapter 9 actually happened? Paul never speaks about Damascus Road experience, though Nazarene Acts does speak, not of the experience, but being on the Damascus Road or the Jericho Road at any rate. Can we believe that?
And that Damascus Road could very well be, Damascus could be Qumran there, that a lot of people don't realize. But moving along, let's go down a little bit further in the same letter. He says, because this is happening, because people are taking my words to be anti-Torah, he's therefore that no such thing be done. For this end I have prayed and besought you not to communicate the scrolls of my preaching that I have sent you to anyone, whether of our own tribe or of another tribe, before trial. But if anyone, having been tested, has been found worthy, then to hand them over to him according to the initiation of Moshe, by which he delivered his scrolls to the 70 who succeeded to his chair, in order that thus they may keep the faith, or the trust there, and everywhere deliver the rule of truth, explaining all things after our tradition, lest being themselves dragged down by ignorance, being drawn into error by conjectures after their mind, they bring others into the like pit of destruction. Now the things that seemed good to me I have fairly pointed out to you, and what seems good to you do you, my master, becomingly perform. So the reason I said this part is simply to show that right here, Kepha puts a lockdown on the stuff that's going to be disseminated, how much and to who. So it stands to reason then that we wouldn't have in the canon proper all of the stuff that we would want to have, because they put a lockdown on it. So if we find a more obscure text or texts, say like the Clementines, that would at least be circumstantial evidence to say that, hey, the reason they're not as accepted, or the reason that they're not in as great a number, is because of the lockdown that was put on them, because people were using them to be anti-Torah. Another thing I wanted to show here was down here in Appendix C. Let me see here. Oh, I didn't resume sharing. I read that last part and didn't share it with you guys. the lost chapters recovered from the Clementine homilies. This is Appendix C, which we situate after Books 3, Chapter 1, restored in this appendix so as to keep the various editions page consistent. This section of the homilies corresponds to the lost section of the recognitions. There is some overlap on both ends for context. So basically, what's going on here is when the original person who was translating the recognitions into English, he said that chapters, I think it's 3 through 10 or 2 through 11 or something like that, a big chunk of chapters from the recognitions could not be translated. And I had the exact quote. I don't see where it is right now, but the quote was said in such a way that he didn't go on and say, hey, it was incoherent, we couldn't understand it. He didn't go on and say, hey, the pages were missing. He didn't go on and say, hey, he didn't specifically say what was wrong. He just said, we cannot translate this section. And so in the way that he worded it and in his conspicuous manner, it has led a lot of people to think that there was nothing wrong with the letters, that they couldn't translate it, but maybe the message of what it was saying. So anytime you see the Latin version of the recognitions being translated, chapters, I think 2 through 11 or whatever it is, the end of 2 through the beginning of 11, they're not in the text. And so here, in the Nazarene Acts of the Apostles, this PDF, obviously Jackson put the Appendix C at the bottom to show, hey, this is what the homilies say in its place. And the homilies seems to be, at least in part, a cleaned up version of the recognitions. But the Syriac version does have some things that they do have parts of the end of chapter 2 and 3 and 4 all the way to 11. And so in the Syriac version here, it says, get it again. In the Syriac version, I was just trying to make it bigger. It says, now if I say something that our Lord who sent me did not say, this is Peter speaking, I am a false apostle, as having permitted myself to speak something unacceptable to him, capital H him, for whoever does something like this errs, thinking himself better than the one who sent him, and he says things inferior and deficient apart from anything acceptable to the one who sent him. So right here, there is no question in my mind, whether you like him or not, that Paul says things that Yeshua did not say. Paul says things that Moshe did not say. And so the author of the recognitions is putting into Kepha's mouth, Kepha saying, if I say something that our Lord who sent me did not say, I am a false apostle, as having permitted myself to speak something unacceptable to him. So if we take that same litmus test and put it on Paul, then Peter here in Recognitions 2:33 is saying that Paul is a false apostle. Am I logically incoherent, or do you guys follow that track? Everybody's silent. And this is a good book, the Syriac Clementine Recognitions and Homilies. So here, this isn't saying, speaking to Paul by name, but it is definitely putting Paul in a category, because Paul spoke a lot of things about what Yeshua didn't. And that's one of my arguments with people who are very Pauline, at least, or they're a Paulinist, where Paul is the litmus test by which every other person in the canon is judged. And I say, look, Paul was speaking about other things. So he can say this or that or whatever, but I'm still going to go back to what Yeshua said, and I can't use Paul's words to go against Yeshua. So if I know they're not going to change their mind about Paul being inerrant, then I just say, well, I believe that Yeshua was also inerrant, so I can't use the two against each other. But here, this this person who's writing the Clementine recognitions is saying through Peter that if you're saying stuff that Yeshua didn't talk about, then you are a false apostle by definition. And we also see hints of this, not exactly the same thing, but in the book of Acts, in Acts where they cast lots, they only picked people for the 12th apostle out of the ones that knew the Messiah, the ones that walked with him and talked with him, the ones that heard him speak. And the author of Acts is very clear that that was the guidelines for picking that 12th apostle. It had to be someone that was among them that knew the Messiah, which puts, and it's also very interesting that the author of the book of Acts never gives Paul the title of apostle. He never does. Paul calls himself an apostle, but the author of Acts does not call him an apostle. So it's an interesting thing that they wanted someone who had heard the words of Yeshua. Why? Apparently so that he would only speak the words that Yeshua had given them. And it also makes sense then. It forced Paul into to teach a certain doctrine. And you see that being played out in his letters. He's railing against these people who say because they knew the master in the flesh that they were the apostles and he wasn't. So what does he do? He says, hey, we know no man after the flesh, but after the spirit. So he has to create a doctrine that legitimizes his teaching. Now, I'm not, I don't hate Paul. Paul was in an awkward situation. He's going to the Gentiles. He's trying to get as many Gentiles saved as he can. And then he's got people wanting, to come up and have their foreskin cut off immediately. Like, that's a precarious situation. Your following is going to be a lot thinner if that's going on immediately. And then we see at least one version of that getting played out in Acts 15. But he did make certain decisions to try to include as many Gentiles as he possibly could, which is kind of how the 21st century American church thinks, hey, let's evangelize as many people as we can and get as many people saved as we can. But here we see in the recognitions, or especially in the letter from Peter to James, that that's not how they operated. If people are twisting our words, we're going to hold our words back, see who's tried and true, who's faithful, and then give those words to them. It's a different spin on evangelism. And we see that with Yeshua saying, hey, go 2 by 2 to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. If they do not accept you, pray for them and keep telling them about me and keep going out. No, wipe the dust off your feet and get out of there. So Yeshua's form of evangelism lines up with Peter and James's in that letter, or Peter's in the letter to James's form of evangelism, and it's different than Paul's. Any comments, questions, anything?
I sit on the fence about this. I went clear anti-Paul for a while, but kind of came back. Thomas Cosette, who's on Facebook, wrote a book to try to show that Paul was actually the Antichrist spoken of in the little books of John. And I have that book. He came out with some very interesting conceptions. I have no idea where he got them, but some of the words for people used in John indirectly or maybe directly point to Paul as being the so-called Antichrist. And then there's things in the Revelation that if we date that to the 1st century, like those who say they are Jews but are not, etc. We just don't have anything definitive on this. And this is about as close as it comes when you've got these sources, which are supposed to be quite authentic, that talk about my enemy as the same one, the one with the papers and persecuting to the death. And the book of Acts talks about that as well, Paul doing this. Is his movement legitimate? And we go to the people that he speaks of, people saying that Paul wrote in Aramaic, that's ludicrous. the people that he speaks of in his books, you won't find but maybe one or two of all the people he mentions, maybe three, with Hebrew names. Whatever he was doing, he was all out to do it. And if this was Elohim calling him to do this, or Jesus, as it's written, calling him to do this, then like Gamaliel said, if he ever said it, and that is, see, I'm very dubious about the Acts of the Apostles, that leaving them alone, let God sort them out. That's my only concern. I don't like people talking against me. I'm thinking I might be talking against the most revered apostle evangelist that ever lived.
Sure. Absolutely. So that's why I like to go factual. Just what are the facts about it? We obviously, we know for sure that there were Christian groups, Christian meaning Yeshua is the foretold prophet like Moshe, groups that believe that were anti-Paul. We know for sure that in Paul's own words that Paul was a Herodian. Is that correct, Jackson?
He says so himself.
Yes, he says so himself. So Herodians were Edomites. They were Jews by forced conversion in general, and they were Edomites. And there's much in the Torah, Prophets, and Psalms that talks about Edom.
Well, we see also Paul's genealogy. It's posted on, say, sites like Geni, Geni. Paul is in the direct line of Herod Shalome, the sister of Herod the Great. In fact, Paul is Costabaris. Paul is a great-grandson of Shalome.
So we know that for sure. And we know from his own words that he was fighting with the apostles. We know that he was demanding that his version of the gospel be the only version. And we know from Corinthians and we know from Galatians that there were fights about this. And that's not to say that, I could have a disagreement with any one of you. It doesn't mean either one of us are any less followers of Yahweh necessarily. We can just have a disagreement about something. That's okay. And there's a lot of value, I think, in Paul's writings, because there's a lot of things going on in the first century in Jerusalem that we would absolutely have no idea about, thanks to the RCC, if we didn't have his letters. But he is an interesting character for sure. To me, what I find interesting, and I agree with you in some sense, I trust Acts maybe more than you do, but there's certainly, you have to know how to read Acts, I think. I find it interesting that Acts borrows a lot from Josephus, messes some of it up. But I also find it interesting that in the overarching end theme of Acts, where Paul kind of quote unquote takes over for Peter, I think that there is a lot of slights towards Paul in the book of Acts. For instance, he doesn't give him the title apostle. He puts his conversion experience in three different ways as to cast doubt upon the conversion experience. He makes it to where Paul is the only credible witness of the conversion experience, and so therefore he's the lone witness. So even according to Torah, it can't be accepted as fact in a court of law. And he has he has multiple different encounters with paganism in a way that Paul marries Yahwism and paganism that would seem absolutely heretical to the Jewish mind, and strange even to our mind. So when you start reading Acts in that way, I think it brings out a lot of things that we wouldn't understand. But I would agree. I think that it's almost like a rebuttal. It's almost like marrying the idea that quote unquote Christianity started out Jewish, but since the sacking of Jerusalem and renaming it, then it had to become more Greek and Roman.
Yeah.
And so then it's speaking to a different audience.
If I see you Wednesday night, I'm going to show you something. I'm going to use the book of Acts and play the names game, Acts and Luke. Names game is really fun, the way that Luke juggles names. And within names, he codes certain informations. And I discovered one not long ago that it might amaze you. It amazed me at the discovery. But there are so many things that Luke uses to either disguise people or to make them show up places where you would think they wouldn't be. But Wednesday night, I'll show you. Commercial. That was a commercial break.
It sounds interesting. Okay, so nobody's been talking, and we got a few minutes left here. Is there any comments or questions? Anything anybody researched or found? Any pro? There's going to be there are a lot of pro statements in the recognitions and homilies that would line up right with some of the things that Paul said. Don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm pointing out the places where it looks like, hey, this is a pretty good tie to be anti-Pauline, if not anti-Paul. But Paul was in the assembly. Let's say that he was a bad guy and had nefarious, plans and schemes in the background. Even if that was the case, he's still in the assembly. He's going to be doing what the other people do. There's going to be an air of truth about him because he's in the middle of that and he's saying these things. So when he's preaching, you're going to have these sort of, when some people want to like, oh, Paul's bad, so we need to do away with the gifts and this and that. The gifts were occurring in the assembly in the first century. There was obviously prophecy. There was the Spirit was lighting on people. There was people speaking in tongues. There was healings. There was all of this stuff going on, and Paul is addressing some of it in his letters. But even if you were to think he's bad, it doesn't mean that stuff goes away. That stuff is still here. Matter of fact, the Syriac archbishop that I knew did a study to show that in every 2 years, he could prove it every 2 years from Acts chapter 2, the church records somewhere on the planet somebody speaking in tongues. From Acts chapter 2 on, every 2 years at least every 2 years you have a recording of it. So there's a lot of things that can be gleaned from the assembly that's written down by Paul. This is not some sort of bashing him, although it could seem like it because we're pointing out the areas that seem to be doing so, and that's all we're pointing out. So that's just a special bulletin. Anyone?
I would like to ask about, I was not able to find, I lend my hard copy to somebody else, and it's hard for me to find things just in the online version of my copy of the Nazarene Acts, but I looked up some things, and I don't know where, if this, sometimes it seems like the numbering is a little different, but this one says homily 17, I think it's book 1719, and it's supposedly Peter really arguing against Paul's vision. That's not what you talked about, right? You didn't talk about that, right?
I did not speak of that, but Jeremy, you had pointed that out to me this week in our discussion. You want to say something to that?
Well, I just mentioned it last week, I think, and maybe at lunch earlier this week, but I don't have much to add to it. There's just that place where, and I don't think it refers to Paul specifically as much as it just says about Simon's experience of, receiving a vision of Yeshua, in the desert or something like that. It was very similar to Paul's experience, and Simon was saying, hey, this is how I received the revelation. Did you say it was homily 17?
I don't think it goes
Yeah.
up to book 17.
It says, no, it says, well, this is what that's why I'm saying the numbers are referenced differently on
Just give
there.
me some words out of the sentence.
If then our Yahshua appeared to you in a vision, made himself known to you, and spoke to you, it was as one who is enraged with an adversary. And this is the reason why it was through visions and dreams or through revelations that were from without that he spoke to you. But can anyone be rendered fit for instruction through apparitions?
That's what I remember.
And so Jeremy brought up Simon Magus. That's kind of what we talked about last week, was that coded in some of the tellings of what was going on and the back and forth between Kepha and Simon Magus, that he was pointing out things that Paul was doing. But now today when we're talking, I think Jackson said that he just doesn't think, he doesn't see that. And I think, Rich, you also said it has nothing to do with Simon Magus, but yet last week we were saying that it did. I just wonder if anybody, that's what I was trying to find just today, some specific things with that back and forth that looks like it could be, not that Simon Magus was Paul, but that he was referring to some Pauline thoughts, actions, whatever.
Right. Well, yeah, just similar to what I said earlier about how in that one 233 of the Syriac recognitions, where it says, hey, it says that if anyone is preaching something different than the master, then they're a false apostle. So he doesn't mention Paul there, but obviously Paul talks about things different than Yeshua. So in the same way, he's referring to Simon, and Simon says, hey, I had a vision like this, and this is how it was revealed to me. And it's the same exact way that Paul received his vision. And then Peter goes on to explain, hey, if you received a vision that way, that's a demon. Then to me, that automatically correlates to Paul, even if Kepha didn't realize Paul had the vision that way. Which I would think by that point that he would have known that, or maybe that's an actual, or if you want, if you really believe that Simon is Paul, then that's where he finds out about it. But so that's interesting to me. I agree. I think that connects the two. I think that shows that Clementine's Peter, that's what I kind of refer to the theology of Peter in the Clementines. The Clementine's Peter is using that as a slight against Paul, knocking his authority. I do believe that. Now, I don't know if that's true, if that's what the real Peter would have thought, but I believe that that's what that is trying to intimate. I mean, really, we're going by, documents that are old, and we're having to try to figure out this first century Christianity, and we don't have a lot to go on. And I'll tell you, one of the books that I really recommend is I don't even have the dust jacket, so you're not going to be able to tell, is a book called The Fall of Jerusalem and the Christian Church. And by S.G.F. Brandon. And, one of his opening statements is, for the amount of information that we have on Christianity proper, we have almost nothing from the first century in Jerusalem. And he just goes through the different, the different ideas. Like, it's not, another good book by F.F. Bruce is called, Peter, Stephen, James, and John. Peter, Stephen, James, and John by F.F. Bruce. It's a small book, and F.F. Bruce is great because he is a tried and true Christian, and he will defend the Christian doctrine to the nth degree. But yet he's honest that when something doesn't smell right or look right, he'll say, "Hey, this is what it is. This is how it went down." And so, in that book, Peter, Stephen, James, and John, he shows that there was a lot of friction between these guys, and this is how it was. So even in his book, in Bruce's book, Paul, Apostle of the Heart Set Free, which is a very pro-Pauline book, he points out stuff that is not flattering about Paul. And so we don't do this. We don't just do this to Paul. We do this with everybody. We idolize people from the past. Even if you had an old girlfriend or boyfriend, and now you're with somebody and you think back, oh, that person didn't do that. Yeah, but they did a million other things wrong that we like to conveniently forget or something. We do it with George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and all of these people, and they were just, oh yeah, and they won the war for us, and they did this and they did that, but they had problems, they had issues. So Paul had problems and issues. Peter, James, and John had problems and issues. And so I think that to say that there wasn't friction, I mean, we see friction between Paul and Barnabas. We see friction between Paul and Peter. We see friction between Paul and James. There was friction going on. And so it doesn't surprise me that we have documents that flat out say that they were opposed to each other. Flat out say it, insinuating it, because they don't want the friction to boil over into two separate groups, which it eventually did, obviously, with Marcion. But we also have, and this book hits on it a little, the fall of Jerusalem in the Christian church. But even in other books, one of them would be, hold on, let me see it here. Oh, here's that about the partaking of the table of demons. There's a whole set of different books from different authors about the idea that Johannine, however you say that word, I always mess that up, that John's ideas and ways to present the good news overtook Paul's because he lived longer in the last 30 or 40 years of his life, especially as he moved east. And Paul is almost not even spoken about ever during that period in the East where John was. It's as if he didn't even exist. Whereas one of those churches had been founded by Paul. And that's a very intriguing proposition, that a church founded by Paul, and he didn't found all the churches that he preached at. He only founded a couple of them. But one of the ones he founded doesn't even mention Paul, and once from about, I think, 70 to 90, and all of anything that's coming out of there after that is very much sounds like John's versions of the good news. And in fact, there's a lot of stories that say he moved over there. So to me, that goes right along with what Paul says. It says, all in Asia have left me. It doesn't say that they left Yeshua. It says that they left Paul's version of Yeshua. So Paul, in his own words, again, it talks about some of this stuff. But with the idea, go ahead, Marcel.
Just going to ask you, sorry, I'm outside and it gets noisy. That's why I keep muting. But I was just going to ask you where would be a good place to read it? Was there a particular book, or was that several sources that you read about the more of John's version and as he moved east and all of that?
Sure. Yeah, I can post some of that. If you could see the inside of my brain, it is a mess. And so one thing that I've really got to do, and I'll get the books. It'll take me a minute, but I've really got to I've started writing a document where I just put things down so that I can search that document and remember where I got it from. But I've got the quote over here somewhere, so it will tell that book. Unfortunately, some of these books are only in German. And so if you get lucky, you can find one that's written in English, like translated into English. But let me look here real quick, see if I can see it. I don't think it's on this page. Yeah, but one place to start, this book will talk about that some. This is a very valuable book, and it doesn't hit on that greatly. Like, that's not the whole point of the book. There's another book where that's kind of the whole point of the book. But this is a very good place to start, the fall of Jerusalem and the Christian church. But I'll get you that quote. Maybe I'll try to post it in the think tank or something. Yes, I will definitely get that to you.
Thank you. And the other thing as you were talking about, what's in Acts and what's presented, I was thinking, and I've heard this, I think Eisenman has said this, and also Jackson, about the telling of the stoning of Stephen. And I always was taught that, or believed that, I'm not sure if it says it in here, I'm trying to look, but that Paul was present. Maybe not that he instigated the stoning of Stephen, but that he was there, correct?
Yeah, in Acts it says he was there, and it
Okay.
intimates that he was in charge. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I've heard, again, Eisman, different ones say that that's a gloss, and that was really a reference to James being thrown from the temple steps, and that I'm just wondering if that's the case, if that was sort of, somehow switched to the stoning of Stephen, if the purpose of it was to try to keep out of Acts and the New Testament literature of the conflict between Paul and James.
Don't you see that the family of Yahshua is written entirely out of the Gospels, and when it is even mentioned, it's negatively, like in John 7. We got to have some explanation for that. And
right. Another thing is, if you read the Gospel of Mark, every reference to the apostles in the Gospel of Mark is a negative reference. There is no positive references. There are no positive references. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Jackson. Sorry.
that's all.
Yeah, so I think it was. I think that that the author of Acts doesn't want to have Paul stoning James, so he puts the gloss of Stephen, which Jackson has a teaching or a theory on, that Stephen could be a code word for James and not just a made up word out of thin air.
Well, the name Stephanos means the crown, and in the church history, they call James the crown. So that's one of the close identifiers. I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm not even sure I believe that.
It's just a possibility.
There are a number of references there that would make you think so.
And so it makes it much more palatable to have your antagonist that is going to become your protagonist be not throw a stone at Stephen, but yet kind of be in charge, versus push James off the stairs or the pinnacle, depending on which version you read of the temple. So yeah, I mean, I think it is a gloss. How much of it is a gloss and how much of it is true, we don't know. Is there a code word to try to let the people know? Which I'm not absolutely 100% against the idea that the author of Acts was under a mandate to make the Nazarene Acts more palatable, yet wanted to stay true to it by code. I think that's a big possibility. But anyway, so yeah, I think that's definitely a possibility.
Why don't they go and mutilate themselves? He says.
Yeah. And he used the term, and even, yes, why don't they mutilate themselves? Even in Galatians, the term mutilation is the exact same term in the Greek. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jackson. Is when Antiochus Epiphanes is saying that they can't, quote unquote, mutilate themselves anymore, meaning, circumcise.
And in the Roman law too, it's the exact same word.
So I was looking at this earlier this week about Paul and James, and I saw, just by happenstance, it was in Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, and it was saying that Paul had appealed to Caesar and was sent over to Rome by Festus. The Jews were disappointed of the hope in which they had laid their plot against him, and so they turned against James, the brother of the Lord, to whom the throne of the bishop of Jerusalem had been allotted by the apostles. So it's saying that Paul was in Rome at the time that James was killed.
When you take the timeline of Acts and the timeline with Josephus, you find yourself off a few years. So I was thinking that Paul wasn't in Rome until right after. Wait a minute. Josephus talks about the death of James. Right after the death of James, he has Paul in Jerusalem, raised in hell as a Herodian, going around starting riots. So take a look at that in book 20, book 19 or 20 of Josephus. You'll go look up the stoning of James and look 2 paragraphs down. So if that's Paul there, Saulos is Paul, and Josephus does write in chronological order there in the Antiquities, then it wouldn't have been later, maybe till Paul went to Rome. James was circumcised in James was stoned in 62. 62. Now they say Paul was beheaded in 66. However, I don't think that happened to Paul. And I got good reason to say that it didn't. That Paul did not get beheaded and that Paul did not get martyred at all during that time. So that would be another good subject to take a look at chronologically. Of course, we can't know exactly, but if we consider that Josephus writes in chronological order, plus the Saulos in there and what's his brother's name? Costobarus, sure. Saul and Costobarus and the rest of the Herodians are raised in hell against the Nazarenes right after the selection on the martyrdom of James. That tells us something there. If he's not lying, we got to remember too that Josephus is anti-Nazarene to a great extent, because he has to be. But it's interesting that he would be anti-Herodian too.
Yes.
He says right there that Saulos and Costobarus, they didn't get in trouble because they were the kin of the king.
So here I'm looking at the death of James, the brother of our Lord, by Josephus.
Okay, go down a ways, just a little ways.
And just to bring up the first sentence here, it says, now Caesar, upon hearing about the death of Festus, yada, 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 yada. Then they bring Festus now dead.
Note that you find Paul standing by holding their coats when Stephen is stoned, and he's standing by. He's not mentioned as part of the stoning, but he's standing by there raising riots. What kind of riots would he be doing in conjunction with James's martyrdom?
Well, in this case, if we take these two histories together, the one from Eusebius saying that Paul was sent to Caesar by Festus, and then they turned against James later. And then over here in Josephus, it says that now Festus is dead, then they brought James before them.
Well,
before the Sanhedrin.
Look at Acts 28 sometime. See what it says about Paul in Rome. He didn't get in trouble there. He was thought of well, even by the high establishment. That the Jews had nothing to fight him against. Their lawyers didn't even show up.
And I would also mention that if I'm going with Josephus or Eusebius, I'm always, not always, but most of the time going with Josephus. One, because he's closer to the action, and two, because he's only got a 50% vested interest in not telling the truth, and Eusebius has 100% vested interest in not telling the truth.
Well, both of these are in a sense agreeing, is what I'm saying. They're both saying that Festus is a part of the timeline, that James is being brought before the Sanhedrin here after the death of Festus, and that Paul himself was sent by Festus to Rome. Now, I mean, maybe he comes back later and kills James, but that doesn't make any sense, right?
This gives us a good reason to look again at the names game.
Sure.
The three governors, Festus, Florus, Felix, they were all bloodthirsty killers. And here, what does Festus mean? Festive. What does Felix mean? Happy. What does Florus mean? Flowery. I mean, there's something going on here with these names. And it's the same way in Josephus. There's something going on with names there that we haven't quite got yet, but we're getting close. And closeness in the writings of Josephus. Did you find that place where Saulus and Costobarus are mentioned right after James?
Sorry, what was that?
Did you happen to go down a couple of paragraphs and see where Saulus and Costobarus are in proximity to James' stoning?
I'm not sure I'm in the same spot.
It should be right after that. I think it's in book 20.
I'm not even sure where I'm. I just had Googled it, and so I ended up on this page. So,
Okay, maybe I'll look it up here.
this is from Antiquities.
Yeah?
Okay, well,
Book 20, chapter 9.
let's get out of here and go to some real
Yeah.
place I can actually look stuff up. There we go.
Book 20, chapter 9. Okay.
Gosh.
And here we found it. And so it talks about James, his stoning. And let's see where. Boy, you're a fast typer. Where's the rest of it? Oh, I see. We got to go to the next chapter. That section is just packed with references. We got Ananias and Ananias in there, and Jesus Damnius, and the other, let's see, Jesus, son of Gamaliel, son of Damnius, all kinds of names.
Yeah.
I'm trying to find that reference to Saulos. I don't know why I'm not finding it. It ought to be right here. Nero. Josephus, Saulos, Costobarus.
Also, Marcel, just looking up certain different things about the early church leaders and early meaning 90 AD to 160 AD, 150 AD. You don't hardly find any quotes about Paul. Justin Martyr does not mention Paul. He was 103 to 165. Papias doesn't even mention Paul. Matter of fact, he doesn't even mention John or Luke. He did not know of John or Luke, and he was around at about 100 or 105. He just knows of Matthew and Mark. And we don't even know if he has the same versions that we had.
Sometimes I wonder if Papias is even genuine. If you've read his other things, like the story about Judas and...
Right, but I mean, we've got quotes from Eusebius, red light, about Papias.
Yeah.
Papias said this, Papias said that. So to me, number one, I see a reason for Eusebius to put words in Papias's mouth. Number two, I don't see a reason for Eusebius to not put John and Luke into Papias's mouth unless they weren't around at the time and Eusebius didn't have a problem with it. It's just very interesting that Luke Acts and John were not around at 105 AD.
Yeah.
According to Eusebius's quoting of Papias.
Well, Saul and Costa-Barros are in, I just found it, Josephus book 20, 214. What was the other one? 197. So they're just like five paragraphs or 5 little chapters apart. It's the proximity of the two is what's astounding, and the proximity of geographically of Paul with Stephanos when he is being stoned. We could look into Isaac and see what he's got on that. But
can you throw that reference into the chat, the exact the work and then the page number?
Yeah. Yes. 27. Coming, mother.
So I'm in chapter 9 where it says James was slain. Where were you? Antiquities, book 20.
Book 20, 214. Chapter 9?
Yeah.
Oh.
Festus was now dead, chapter 9.
Yeah. Is that chapter 9? So that's book 20, chapter 9.
Yeah.
It's book 20, chapter 9. In the version I have, it's like paragraph 4. And James is in paragraph 1, I believe, where he gets killed.
I think we got 2 different numbering systems here.
Yeah, I think so. I'm sorry. But it's only a little bit down, like you say.
Yeah, it's just right
I see.
afterwards.
Ananias here in paragraph 4, yeah. Trying to find I see Jesus, the son of Gamaliel. Jesus, the
Book
son
20,
of...
chapter 9, 1 is James. I'm getting confused.
Yeah, book 20, chapter 9, 1 is James, yeah.
So we have Solos. They're within 100 lines. Is that 100? Within 200 lines. Which
Still
isn't
looking
much.
for that one. What's the reference for Solos?
2214. See if you have it in your version.
214.
2214, right?
Yeah. All that stuff's in 20.
20.
Yeah, I definitely don't have a 214. Let's try this.
You don't have a 214? We got 2 different numbering systems going.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well, one-
Allison, what is it? You've always got the goods.
I don't know. Mine's it's 20, chapter 9, and then it starts with wait a minute. Oh, I gotta find it. About this time, it was that King Agrippa built Caesarea Philippi larger than it was before, and in honor of Nero, named it Neronlas. And it's in that paragraph. When he had built a theater at Berytus with vast expenses, he bestowed that part.
That's different than what I got.
Yeah,
It says
I've got,
here
and
it's
now
the same
Caesar, upon hearing the death of Festus, sent Albinus into Judea.
Yeah, that's what I have.
Wow.
Okay, look.
All
I
right.
found this again. Josephus on James, Antiquities 29, 20 and 9.
Yeah.
I'm going to do Saul.
So what
Okay.
is 22:14?
It's 4. It's 9, paragraph 4. I found it.
It is.
Yeah, it's down at the bottom.
Cost of Arms also and Salos did themselves get together a multitude of wicked wretches.
All right.
Okay.
So can you put those references on chat? Are we using two different reference?
Well, no, it's the same. It's just I think there's two different there are two different numbering systems within the same book. It's not a different book.
Oh.
It's how you look at the numbers. So basically, so the 29 is basically book 20, chapter 9.
Paragraph 4.
Paragraph 4.
No, but James is there's a little number is 197 next to it.
Oh.
So it's 197 in it says number 1, but then it has a little subscript that says 197. Then, which is what you're using for Salos, you're doing chapter 22:14, which is actually chapter 9.
Oh.
Number 4, and then under number 4 there's a subscript that says 2:14.
Would you please put that up here on the chat?
Well, I've got it in a hard copy.
Do you have fingers?
No,
There.
I have no
Oh,
fingers.
it cut off part of it.
You can't type it on there?
So Salos
You
is
lazy
mentioned-
fellow.
No, I'm doing it.
I've got
Salos
it.
is 20.9.1, and then the subscript number is 197. Or I'm sorry, that's not Salos, that's James. My bad. And then Salos is
Yeah, we don't want Salos there, right?
no, James is 29.1, number 197. Salos is 29.4, number 214. So you're saying because of the proximity of James being slain, and then it's showing quote unquote Salos right after that in the
Yeah.
same city, that would be Paul.
Well, think of this. If we're talking about the same chronological order here as everything else, everything's in chronological order in Antiquities from clear back to Adam and Eve. And you got these things both in the same reference as the death of Festus, and then we have this thing happening one after the other. Why doesn't it say that Salos got his head chopped off? Well, because he got away with everything because he was a Herodian. And here we have him in the same chapter in book 20 of James being stoned. And what is Paul doing? If this is Paul, he's going around and causing riots. Just exactly what Acts says about his rioting. Plus, we've got, who was Paul's companion half the time? Barnabas, which is a surname for Joseph of Kypros. Kypros being Paul's mother's name. And then we have Barnabas. We take the Barnabas off, and we have a Costa-Barus, Bar Costa here. We're playing the name game where Barnabas is supposed to be a past king of Cyprus. Cyprus being the name of Paul's mother. Barnabas splitting. Then we have Bar Jesus in Acts 13 and Barnabas again. And then we've got Barsabbas in Acts chapter 1. I want to straighten some of those out on Wednesday night. Now, look, these are all related in some way. There's something behind this. There's something going on here. There's some kind of coding going on. Now, you know who the best candidate for the Acts of the Apostles is? Of the people we know? We don't know anybody named Luke. He's just mentioned in the Acts. If it's autobiographical, wouldn't the person named Luke say, I was there, instead of mentioning his name? But there was someone that was there, and that was Epaphroditus. Josephus takes his works and he dedicates them to Epaphroditus, which is one of Paul's secretaries and also Nero's secretary. Epaphroditus ends up dying at the same time that Clement did for the same thing, being circumcised. And we've got Epaphroditus that served 30 years in the imperial court, who we also have in Paul, who was left sick someplace in Philippians chapter 4. There's something going on with these names here. We have Epaphroditus and we've got Josephus. They're both in the same pod. They knew each other. They loved each other. They were, might as well have been brothers. They both lived in the same place. One dedicates his work to the other. Who's Theophilus? That's another good question. Couldn't that be Josephus? You know, lover of Theos? Of course it could. All right. That's my theory for today. Conspiracies. Yeah, I'm not going to say any more.
Yeah, except for in 105, we don't have Papias knowing Luke or Acts. So Epaphroditus would have had to written in 97, 98.
Yes. 95, 96, 97.
So then why doesn't Papias know about it?
Why would Papias? Papias is the one that said, Papias said, for instance, that Judas was a historical character, that Judas got so fat that he was trying to walk down an alley and got run over by a chariot, and the place stunk so bad that nobody could still go around there 100 years later.
Right, but that still sounds like Eusebius pumping up what Papias said. That doesn't sound like Papias to me.
Well, there's fragments from Hegesippus and Papias that, to me, they're outrageous. Some of the
sure, no, I agree.
So all right. I'm kind of thinking like Hegesippus says, "Yeah, I knew the Apostle John. Sure, I was taught by him." Come on. It's like in Acts, we've got Gamaliel, or in the Nazarene Acts, we've got Gamaliel there that's a secret believer. You know the story of Gamaliel?
Well, I think he's also a secret believer in the Clementines too.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. How could he be a secret believer when he is as rich as Croesus? And there are stories about the riches that he had that are outrageous. I don't know what's true and what's not, if anything's true. We just have to dig around and find these kind of correspondences that you're looking for today. And then I think that we can make a historical judgment as to what in the world is going on here. The judgment's still out on Paul, but I feel like something's coming in soon. It's going to be more definitive.
What book is it that says that the earth is going to cough up the secrets?
Yeah, that's Enoch.
Yeah.
Yes, and we'll be there if we can get them out of the hands of the church.
Amen.
Okay.
All right, that's all I got, unless anybody has any other questions.
Thank you, guys. It's great.
Send all hate mail to Jackson.
All right. You're going up on Hebrew Nation Radio this next week, Monday and Tuesday.
Uh-oh. This one?
Yeah, this one and the last one, Monday and Tuesday.
Got it.
You can go listen to yourself stammering and stuttering around.
I'm going to send myself some hate mail. No, I'm going to send you some hate mail about me.
Yeah. Okay, that'd be great. Later, dudes.
Shabbat shalom.